can have a question.
Ashish, you're quoting an example from a book called Elephant Who Says Elephant Can't Dance, right? So can you re-quote the example that what you're trying to explain in best practices?
Yes, sure. I was not saying that best practices help them. I was saying that IBM at the time when you just took over was a very traditional spread out organization. What they did at that point of time was they focused on some key focus areas, key market areas, and they actually hyped off a portion of their business. So if the best practices were to be followed, they would have simply been doing what their predecessors would have done and not done.
Do you mean that downsizing is one of the best practices?
It can be.
Okay. So I'll also quote the same, a few examples quoted by Lewis Gerstner in same book. See, when IBM before Lewis Gerstner has taken up, it has different marketing departments across different organizations, and each marketing department used to follow their own logos. The best practices that he brought into picture is he standardized the marketing and operation department. Okay, one more best practices at that point of time in the industry is to have the services, is not to have a services industry for the product. And he has actually brought the best practice from Oracle and Microsoft to go into services model. And of course, the best practices you're telling that it was not being followed in IBM at that point. No. My point is they have followed the best practices from the industry, which has been copycatted from Microsoft.
Let me again go back to my point. What I was saying is that disruptive innovations help them succeed. IBM could have done all that and still not succeeded. The balance sheet was very bad, and I'm sure you would have known that.
Disruptive innovations which has taken from the other industry.
No.
That's what the book
I think I should bring up that point here. In this paper, it's possible to bring up that back. I think so. Scroll down. This will control this one. So, yeah. Look at the paragraph here. So, IBM set up a separate business unit only to focus on mini computer at that point of time. And that was what helped them through.
I want to speak about the same example that you're quoting. That mini computer which IBM has introduced in the market and subsequently the other the system has been copycatted from Microsoft.
Exactly, it's a concept.
That itself speaks the best practice.
That's the best practice they're taken from Microsoft. I realize mainframes are not in the market now, so they have to go for best practice.
Correct. I will again say that there is also.
And I just want to quote one more example. You just quoted one more example. IBM was not into services at that moment of time. They are just into product and there's maintenance. They introduced service systems in IBM just from HP. They started looking at HP and then moved into the services industry.
I'll take your first point. That probably when I'm talking about innovations here and I'm talking about IBM, yes, it was a borrowed innovation, probably is an example of best practice. On the second point, I will disagree. I think IBM has been in the professional services space for a very long time. So I would probably question your point over there. I don't think that IBM has entered professional services only when HP integration is happening. I don't think that is good.
We all started when HP all started.
In fact, quoting the point of the book which you raised and one of the things that I talked about was Apple approaching the same company with different consulting representatives, where there was a redundancy in the way people are getting the deals. The same person was contacted by different departments of IBM selling the same service. I don't think that's the valid point. And again, coming over here, when you talk about a best practice, if you notice, it said that the mini computer had failed. So if the mini computer had failed, then it was not a best practice. They latched onto the concept, identified it as something that can sell for their business, and that is why they adopted it. Why is it that they ran away with it and others could not? The point here being, a best practice becomes a best practice when it's repeated in certain fashion. It wasn't over here, and that is why it is still called disruptive innovation. I don't call it, Gartner calls it. I'm just quoting you something which I've seen.
I have one question, Ashish and here. Ashish and Vijay, both of you. I think the topic for discussion today was cost of implementing, right? I think we are probably missing the word cost here of implementing best practices versus the benefits what they are able to deliver. So, would any one of you be able to quantify the cost versus benefit, right? In terms of how much cost versus what benefit Do you have some figures to showcase or any specific case study to look at the cost of implementation versus the benefit? Because again, we might have $1 billion cost on probably implementing a best practice, but the benefit delivered could be like just centralizing a help desk, right? So you cannot really quantify. You have to both consider the cost and then the benefit. So would you be able to throw some light on
That's
it?
that's a very
That's just to interrupt. I just want to add a couple of points from my end in the same question actually. You have used very well actually one slide over there which was describing the cost of so many things. You probably missed two very important costs over there, cost of debug and cost of innovation over there. Probably you can help me understand in the same
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this question, very insightful, and thanks for bringing us back on track. If you could just open that slide, please, if it's okay with you. I think it's slide number 4. Anyway, I do not have any quantitative data to back up the fact whether cost of whether the benefits far outweigh the cost. I couldn't find it. But what I can say over here is that when I am doing an internal implementation, there might be some costs which might be lesser. For example, the opportunity cost which I was putting in over here was basically the opportunity cost of the organization not innovating. The cost of implementation will be there, but it will still have the lesser number of costs, a lesser amount of cost because it is being done in-house, it is being done internally without the involvement of external consultants. When you're talking about the cost of training, if people themselves have been involved in identifying the best practice, the training costs are bound to be lower. So in my opinion, I can only make an educated guess that if I have to implement a practice which has been brought from outside, most of these cost heads would be lower in value compared to something that has been would be higher in value compared to something that has been developed in-house. And that is the basis of my argument here. That we have all these costs which are there as a part of implementing any best practice. Most of these cost heads are higher, but I do not have a data to back it up, so I'm not going to harp too much.
So, another part of the question.
Sorry, Yogendra, sir, I can answer your question as well before you pose a different question. Yeah, so this is a very, very interesting question which every CIO organization asks, especially people who are from consulting profession and all that. This is an important point which comes up. ROI, return on investment. What is my return on investment? And this is where what we basically have seen, and this is explicitly quantifiable, as you mentioned, it's not, but in some areas, very explicitly quantifiable, and in some areas where we really have to tell the customer that it's difficult. You can measure it in form of customer satisfaction, but you may not be able to measure it in form of value. And in some times we say you have to just give some time to measure it. Now I'll talk about the areas where I don't have slides, but I can actually show you, I can say you, and you will say, yeah, I knew about it. These are the something which you won't be knowing it. Take for the best practices like a Green Belt project, a Six Sigma project, or theory of constraints which we use. These things purely are based on the cost perspective. In the beginning itself, you are basically defining what is my current investment in this and what will be my return on investment after this project. We've been able to do some lean projects where we have clearly shown cycle time for production of a unit was taking 5 minutes before. After this project was done, cycle time of that product was clearly reduced to 3 minutes. Absolutely quantifiable. Customer was able to explicitly see no additional resources were put into picture. So there are some projects of my best practices very clearly. Outsourcing model, if you say, I don't have to say. Central consolidation of service desk. Clients were having multiple service desks across regions. One of the best practice proposed was, why don't you go for a centralized service desk as proposed in service management? Immediately client was able to see, I'm able to get 24/7 support by moving to the model to a different country. So there are certain areas where ROI is very explicitly seen. Certain areas like capacity management and all those investments where are there. These are the areas where I have really seen customer has to give time and measurable in form of customer satisfaction and all. So there are some very easy case studies available which will
Surprisingly, I disagree with you on this one a little bit. Tightly. First of all, I think the question was whether I have the data to back it up. I don't. There is data in the industry, but it's not published. It depends on case to case. And I take exception to the fact that Six Sigma is being quoted as an example here. Six Sigma has two things. You can either do a DMAC or DMAC. You also know that. A DMAC is there when you're creating a new process itself. A DMAC is when you're differently using something existing. So it can actually work both ways. So I don't think it's a perfect example. If you are having an ingrown process, a homegrown process, it can be done in system also. If you're basically improving something which already exists, that can also be done in system. My point here, and I'm trying to answer the question, is nobody in the industry publishes data outside of the world telling them how exactly the ROI has been improved. They can say it, but then again back it up by using subjective measures like either CSAT, and that's a very valid way of looking at it. Reduction in defects, reduction in throughput time, reduction in cycle time. It will vary across the sector. So it's specific. And rather than going into a debate mode, let's again give it back to the point. Every initiative, whether it's an implementation of a best practice or whether it's an implementation of a homegrown product, as Vijay was also pointing out in the slide, is essentially a measure of ROI. You basically look at what is the ROI of various stages and see whether it suits you or not. Whether it's a best practice or whether it's a homegrown process, you're still going to go through the same process. What I'm saying is that when you have these processes, you finally have all these costs available, changing something that you already have, it probably be
Ashish, I don't know, but as you said, yes, information is confidential, but because Yogendra has actually asked specifically, like, do you have data? So I have data, I can show you, but yeah, these are confidential information, but nothing new. People out here know, and as I said, certain best practices easily quantifiable. As I mentioned about service desk cost, immediately getting cut down by going into a new model. Cycle time reduction in manufacturing company. We are able to immediately show to the customer that we are able to cut down on the cycle time. Things like cloud computing. Yesterday we were talking about ServiceNow. Customer is paying currently X amount for service management tool with the services. Immediately after going to this particular new best practices of cloud computing, they are able to immediately see ROI. So I don't think that all best practices you can't give ROI. Definitely, there are a lot of best practices for which you can give ROI, but for some, yes, you have to give time and measure it in a different manner.
And the funny thing is that, and I'm probably putting in a point which is somewhat against the profession, that none of these ROIs actually make it to the cost statement values. Because they're so subjective. If I do a project, you do a project, you do an ROI on it, we might end up with different values.